Normandy, June 1944. Dawn seeps through the torn canvas of a field hospital tent. The air smells of wet canvas, carbolic, and blood. Outside, stretcher bearers move through the mist, boots sinking into the churned soil of a makeshift clearing near Bayeux. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, artillery rumbles, a dull, constant pulse that never quite fades. Inside, among the rows of cots, a British nurse works with quiet precision. Her uniform, once white, is mottled with the gray dust of Normandy and the faint rust of dried blood. She is one of hundreds of Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service sisters, who followed the troops ashore after D-Day, trained, disciplined, bound by regulation and hierarchy. But this morning, in this tent, something will change. Orders will be tested. Lives will hang in the balance. And one act, unapproved, unauthorized, but rooted in humanity, will save dozens who were meant to be left behind. It would later be called forbidden. But to those who survived, it was salvation. By the summer of 1944, Britain's war had entered its most punishing phase. The invasion of Normandy, Operation Overlord, was the culmination of 4 years of endurance, innovation, and sacrifice. Yet even in victory's shadow, the human cost was immense. Within hours of the landings on 6 June, thousands of Allied wounded were being ferried from the beaches to hastily established field hospitals, under canvas and corrugated iron, for the Royal Army Medical Corps, RAMC, and the Queen, Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service, QAIMs. The campaign presented an extraordinary test. Casualty estimates had been grim. Planners at CHEF expected up to 10,000 Allied losses on D-Day alone. Every mobile medical unit, every dressing station, every surgical team was stretched to breaking point. The official British Army Medical Services reports later described those first weeks as a continuous relay of wounded from chaos to care. These field hospitals, casualty clearing stations, CCS, were placed as close to the front as tactically possible, often within earshot of the guns. Their role was to stabilize and operate on the gravely wounded before evacuation to England. In theory, strict triage rules governed every decision. The wounded were categorized: immediate, delayed, minimal, or expectant. The last, expectant, meant there was little hope of survival. Resources were to be conserved for those more likely to live. For the nurses, this system was a daily torment. They had been trained to obey, to treat according to protocol, to conserve scarce plasma, morphine, and bandages. Yet when faced with young soldiers gasping for air or whispering for water, the rules could feel unbearable. Many of these women had served through the North African and Italian campaigns, where shortages were constant, and improvisation was the difference between life and death. But in Normandy, the scale of carnage was new. The tented wards were sweltering by day and freezing by night. Mosquitoes hovered over surgical tables. The constant roar of trucks and artillery made sleep impossible. Instruments were boiled in kerosene tins. Nurses worked in shifts that stretched 18 hours or more, often with only tea and biscuits to sustain them. Letters home, later preserved in the Imperial War Museum archives, speak of exhaustion, fear, and a profound sense of duty. One Kyaum sister wrote from Normandy on 14th of June 1944. "We can hear the guns all night. Sometimes the sky lights with flares and tracers, and the men come in so fast we can scarcely keep up. I never imagined so many could be saved or lost in a single day." In such conditions, the line between obedience and conscience grew thin. The nursing service was rigidly hierarchical. Discipline was considered essential to survival. Orders were relayed through the matron, who answered to the senior medical officer. Defiance, even with good intent, could mean a court-martial or dismissal from service. Yet, as recorded in our AMC correspondence, quiet acts of courage occurred daily. An extra transfusion given without authorization. A patient moved without clearance. A morphine dose adjusted to ease final moments. The war's medical doctrine demanded detachment, but these women saw too much to remain untouched. Each stretcher carried a reminder of the cost of liberation. Many of the wounded were scarcely out of school. Some still clutched letters or photographs from home. In that world of mud, blood, and quiet endurance, one nurse, posted to a CCS just outside Bayeux, would make a decision that defied military regulation. Her action would break the written rules of triage and evacuation. It would risk her career and perhaps her liberty, yet it would save the lives of men who had been marked to die. Her name appears, discreetly, in a handwritten note preserved in the National Archives, a 107 series, among reports filed in late June 1944. The entry is brief. Intervention by nursing sister contrary to protocol. Outcome successful. No further explanation was added. What lay behind that single, understated sentence would reveal the unrecorded courage of Britain's wartime nurses, women who stood between order and compassion, discipline and mercy. The casualty clearing station outside Bayeux in June 1944 was a world of contrasts. Military efficiency set against scenes of profound human fragility. Rows of bell tents lined the hedgerows, each marked with a red cross painted hastily on canvas. A small convoy of ambulances from the beaches arrived every hour, engines coughing, tires coated in chalk dust. Beneath the flicker of hurricane lamps, surgeons and nurses worked in a rhythm that never stopped. Clean, cut, stitch, move on, the unit's war diary, later archived under WO 177-912, recorded more than 4,000 casualties treated in the first fortnight after D-Day. Medical officers noted shortages of plasma, bandages, and penicillin, still a scarce commodity in mid-1944, rationed under British Army control. Every vial was logged and counted. Unauthorized use could lead to charges of misconduct. In that system, rules saved lives by rationing them, yet they also condemned many to die. The QIMN's nurses were not ordinary auxiliaries. They were commissioned officers, trained to manage trauma, infection, and shock in mobile warfare. Their oath was both military and moral, to preserve life as far as duty permits. But duty was a flexible word in the chaos of Normandy. A single decision, a transfusion given outside the triage list, a stretcher moved ahead of its turn, could tip the balance between discipline and defiance. Among those stationed near Bayeux was Sister Margaret Thompson, aged 31, from Lancashire. Her personnel card preserved in QM's files, lists service in Tobruk, El Alamein, and later Italy before the Normandy posting. Colleagues described her as steady, reserved, and decisive under pressure. She was no rebel, no romantic figure of legend, merely a professional nurse hardened by years of battlefield medicine. Her CCS, No. 33 Field Hospital Unit, under the 21st Army Group, operated within earshot of artillery. Casualties from Gold Beach arrived hourly, many with abdominal and thoracic wounds caused by shrapnel and machine gun fire. These injuries in 1944 were often fatal. Evacuation routes were still forming. Surgical supplies came in unpredictable waves. The chain of command was clear. Matron in charge oversaw nursing discipline. Major, RAMC authorized all critical medical interventions field. Surgeons decided priority based on prognosis. Any deviation required written approval, an impossible formality, in a tent filled with the dying. It was here that Thompson found herself confronting an impossible choice. On the morning of 12th of June 1944, a truck arrived carrying 12 severely wounded men from an infantry battalion hit near Tilly-sur-Seulles. 3 were listed as expectant, beyond help according to triage notes. But one of them, a 19-year-old private with shrapnel wounds to the abdomen, was conscious and begging for water. Thompson examined him and saw signs that with surgery and transfusion, survival was possible. The surgeon in charge, overrun with cases, marked the tag red, no operation. The boy was placed aside, morphine administered for comfort, and the team moved on. For most, that would have been the end. Thompson, however, recorded the boy's blood type and noted that a compatible donor had just been operated on in the adjacent ward. Regulations forbade the diversion of blood plasma without a doctor's order, yet she had seen similar wounds survive in North Africa when treated early. As she later wrote in a private letter to a fellow nurse, preserved today in the Imperial War Museum's nursing collection, I could not look at him and do nothing. Orders said wait. My conscience said otherwise. Such conflicts were not rare, but few were documented. The culture of wartime medicine discouraged open dissent. Yet the ethical strain on nurses was immense. In reports collected after the war by the Royal College of Nursing, many described moments when they acted first and reported later. In Sister Thompson's case, the act that followed would quietly break regulations, risk her commission, and save multiple lives. It would unfold within the hour, under shell fire with rationed blood, and against direct orders. The story of that act, and the aftermath that followed, reveals the hidden front of British wartime medicine. The moral battlefield fought in the space between protocol and compassion. War nurses were not soldiers, yet they faced the front line with equal courage. For women like Sister Margaret Thompson, the battlefield was not a place of attack or defense. It was a theater of endurance. Their weapon was discipline, their armor, compassion. Born in Lancashire in 1913, Thompson trained at St. Thomas's Hospital in London before enlisting in the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service in 1939. Like many of her peers, she joined out of a sense of duty rather than adventure. By 1944, she had seen 4 campaigns, each imprinting lessons about pain, infection, and the frailty of life. Her letters reveal no bravado. Instead, they speak of exhaustion and restraint. We patch them up and they go. We never ask where, only that they wake again. That sentence, preserved in her service papers, captures the stoicism of her generation. For the British public, nurses symbolized compassion. For the military machine, they were vital instruments of morale and survival. Yet in practice, they lived between two worlds, bound by regulations, haunted by conscience. Thompson's Forbidden Act did not spring from defiance, but from a simple human truth, that compassion in war sometimes demanded disobedience. When she saw the young soldier marked as no operation, she recognized not just a patient, but a son, a brother, a life still within reach. The ethical boundary that separated discipline from mercy had become intolerably thin. The Normandy campaign forced British medical services into constant movement. Unlike the established hospitals of earlier wars, the 1944 casualty clearing stations were designed to advance and retreat with the front line. Their mobility made them efficient and dangerously fragile. The RAMC doctrine, codified in wartime field service regulations, demanded speed above all. Each CCS operated on a throughput principle, to treat, stabilize, and evacuate in the shortest possible time. Within that model, every minute of indecision could cost multiple lives. Sister Thompson Station near Bayeux sat just behind the 30 Corps advance. Its tents were pitched on farmland, the ground softened by rain and shell fire. Water pumps clogged, generators faltered, and supplies arrived hours late. Nurses sterilized instruments in biscuit tins, improvised splints from rifle crates, and worked under blackout cloth. Under such conditions, triage became law. The color-coded system, red, yellow, green, blue, determined fate at a glance. The expectant were given morphine and left to rest until they slipped away. Not out of cruelty, but necessity. As one RAMC surgeon later recalled, to save the many, one had to let the few go. Yet field hospitals were not sterile factories. They were human spaces, alive with empathy and instinct. When Sister Thompson diverted a bottle of plasma from a priority case to an expectant one, she broke the chain of command. But tactically, it was a calculated risk. Her decision, grounded in field experience, reflected an understanding of trauma survival beyond the formal training. Manuals, the Forbidden Act, would not only save that young soldier, it would spark a quiet debate among her unit about how flexible compassion could be in the machinery of war. By 1944, medicine had become as decisive a weapon as any gun. British innovation, much of it driven by necessity, transformed the odds of survival. Blood transfusion units, mobile surgical teams, and penicillin therapy represented the cutting edge of Allied medicine. Yet these miracles were scarce. The British Blood Transfusion Service, established in 1938 under Dr. Janet Vaughan, had perfected the transport of stored plasma from England to the continent. Each tin carried enough plasma to save one man, but only if used quickly and precisely. Each vial was logged under strict accountability. Nurses like Thompson knew this system intimately. They tracked blood groups on paper tags pinned to uniforms, prepared transfusion sets by candlelight, and monitored pulse rates with little more than intuition. In the first days after D-Day, hundreds of transfusions were given under fire. The Forbidden Act she performed, administering plasma and initiating surgery without a formal order, broke both regulation and hierarchy. Yet medically it was sound. The boy's vital signs, as later noted in the CCS report, stabilized within the hour. This was the intersection of science and courage, a calculated defiance that embodied the evolution of battlefield medicine. Thompson's experience in North Africa had taught her that shock and blood loss could reverse dramatically if treated early. She acted not out of rebellion, but from a professional instinct sharpened by years in the field. Her defiance thus symbolized a broader truth about wartime Britain, the triumph of practical intelligence over rigid rule, of quiet innovation over blind obedience. In that tent near Bayeux, the machinery of modern medicine met the morality of individual choice. The nurse's action would echo far beyond that morning. Within her unit, whispers spread, admiration from some, unease from others. Her matron, torn between discipline and respect, would soon be forced to report the breach. And with that report, the stage was set for a confrontation between regulation and humanity. The British Army of 1944 was a machine built on order. Every instruction, whether on the beaches or in a hospital tent, was designed to maintain control amid chaos. The Royal Army Medical Corps operated under this same discipline. To disobey an order, even in a medical context, was not a small matter. It was a breach of military law. The matron in charge of No. 33 Casualty Clearing Station, Miss Evelyn Brooks, embodied that order. A veteran of the Western Desert and a recipient of the Royal Red Cross, she enforced procedure with quiet authority. Her duty was to protect both her nurses and the men they served, and that duty rested upon one principle: discipline saves lives. In her view, rules ensured fairness and efficiency. They were the only defense against chaos. When word reached her that Sister Thompson had diverted plasma and ordered a surgeon to operate without written authority, her reaction was immediate. She noted the breach in her logbook, marking it serious irregularity as to be reported. Yet Brooks also delayed the report by several hours. That hesitation, captured in her later testimony to the RAMC Command Inquiry Board, reveals the silent conflict between command and conscience. Brooks understood the context. She knew the conditions: overrun tents, wounded flooding in, doctors collapsing from exhaustion. She knew, too, that Thompson's act had saved not one but several men. The transfused plasma had been shared across multiple operations when the donor supply ran low. The leadership dilemma here was quintessentially British, a conflict between enforcing order and recognizing initiative. The Army's culture valued judgment under fire, but only within defined parameters. Thompson's decision fell outside them, heroic, yes, but procedurally indefensible. In later statements preserved in the National Archives Medical Service files, senior officers admitted the moral difficulty of punishing those whose infractions had saved lives. One colonel wrote bluntly, "In war, humanity cannot always await written permission." That sentiment never became official doctrine, but it defined the leadership tension at the heart of wartime medicine: the need to maintain authority, even when authority itself risked stifling compassion. At its core, Sister Thompson's story is not one of defiance but of conscience. War reduces moral choice to its simplest form: obey or disobey, live or die. Yet within that binary, the human spirit still searches for right and wrong. The Army Nursing Service Regulations of 1938 required absolute compliance with medical orders. Every act outside those bounds could be treated as conduct prejudicial to good order. Yet the very nature of nursing, its intimacy with pain, its immediacy of response, inevitably blurred those lines. For the nurses who served in France, the emotional burden was immense. They were witnesses to suffering on an industrial scale, but they were not permitted to grieve, question, or hesitate. One anonymous QAIMS report filed in 1945 described the strain succinctly. "One must appear calm while the world is ending an arm's length away." Thompson's forbidden act forced her, and those who judged her, to confront a moral paradox. Could mercy itself be an act of disobedience? Was her duty to the rulebook or to the life before her? The ethics of triage had been shaped by necessity, not philosophy. Expectant cases were left to die not because they were unworthy, but because saving them would consume the resources needed for others. Yet in that logic lay an unbearable truth. The system valued efficiency over compassion. Thompson's decision broke that equation. She refused to accept that a human life could be measured by probability alone. After the incident, she was summoned before her matron and the unit's senior medical officer. The inquiry, though informal, carried real weight. The official record, sparse and cautious, notes that Sister acted without clearance but with commendable result. No disciplinary action followed, but the event was logged as procedure required. For Thompson, the cost was personal, not legal. Her matron's tone cooled. Her peers regarded her with quiet admiration tinged with unease. She continued to serve, promoted later to senior sister, yet she spoke little of the incident again. Decades later, when interviewed for a BBC oral history program in the 1960s, she offered only one reflection. We were told to do our duty, but sometimes duty meant listening to something deeper. Her words capture the quiet moral core of Britain's wartime service. The nation's endurance rested not only on courage in battle, but on the humanity of those who cared for the fallen. In that tent near Bayeux, the strict machinery of war met its moral limit, and for a moment compassion prevailed. Within days, the guns moved east, and the CCS packed up to follow the advance. The incident was noted, filed, and forgotten amid the thousands of official pages that chronicled Britain's war. Yet the lives saved that morning endured, living testaments to a decision that bent the rules to serve a higher purpose. Ahead lay new battles, fresh casualties, and greater tests of endurance. But for Sister Thompson, nothing would equal that dawn in June 1944, when one act of forbidden mercy defined what it truly meant to serve. June 1944, 05:40 hours, near Bayeux. The rain had eased, leaving a low mist drifting over the hedgerows. The first evacuation convoy had departed an hour earlier, bound for the landing craft hospitals anchored off Arromanches. Inside the tented ward, lamps flickered as the generator sputtered. The night shift was ending, but no one had slept. On the central trestle table lay 3 stretchers, each occupied by men too weak to move. Sister Margaret Thompson adjusted her apron, now streaked with iodine and blood. Around her, the air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and fuel oil. The surgical team, 2 young RAMC captains, worked without pause, sleeves rolled up, sweat cutting tracks through the dust on their faces. The triage chart for the incoming convoy had been pinned to a wooden post. 12 new casualties, 3 listed as expectant. Thompson glanced at the names, then at the figures before her. The youngest, Private Arthur Millen, 191st Battalion Hampshire Regiment, had a shrapnel wound to the abdomen, severe blood loss, pulse faint but steady. His triage tag bore a red diagonal slash, no operation. She had seen wounds like his before. North Africa, 1942. There, a transfusion had meant survival. Here the rules forbade it. The plasma tins, stamped British Red Cross London, were rationed for priority surgical cases only. Each bottle accounted for, each needle signed out. Outside, another truck arrived. The matron called for stretcher bearers, her voice hoarse. "Keep the line moving!" The night hummed with activity. Muffled orders, the rattle of trolleys, the murmur of men half-conscious from morphine. Thompson checked the boy's pulse again. It fluttered, but it was there. She called to an orderly, "Get me a unit of type O plasma." The man hesitated. "Ma'am, Major's orders, no issue without signature." She looked him in the eye. "Then this one's on my signature." The moment was quiet but decisive. She scribbled her initials on the requisition slip, an act small enough to escape notice yet weighty enough to alter everything. She fitted the cannula herself, blood tracing a fine crimson thread through the tube. As the fluid entered the boy's veins, his breathing steadied. The monitors, rudimentary dials measuring pulse and pressure, began to climb. "Prep for surgery," she said calmly. The surgeon turned, incredulous. "He's not cleared." "He is now." A pause. Then, seeing the improvement, the doctor nodded. The boy was lifted onto the table. Outside, shellfire thudded faintly from the direction of Tilly-sur-Seulles. Dust sifted from the tent's ridgepole. Inside, the field hospital became a world apart, a chamber of focus amid the wider storm. They worked fast. Scalpel, swab, clamp. Thompson assisted with the suction tube, her movement steady despite the tremor in her arms. The wound was deep but clean. The surgeon muttered a single word, "Lucky," as he tied the last suture. The transfusion line still ran, pale amber fluid dripping into the vein. By 07:10, the boy's pulse had stabilized. His color returned faintly. Thompson exhaled for the first time in an hour. Around her, the tent seemed suddenly still. Then came the matron's voice, sharp, low, controlled. "Sister Thompson, a word, please." Outside, the morning light was harsh. The matron's expression gave nothing away. "You ordered plasma?" "Yes, matron, without authorization." "Yes, matron." A silence, then a slow nod. "He lives?" "He does." Another pause. "See that your report is filed properly." The matron turned and walked away. Thompson stood for a moment, the cool air washing over her. Her hand still smelled of antiseptic and iron. Behind her, the boy slept, breathing evenly, impossibly alive. By mid-morning, the CCS was moving again. Orders came to relocate nearer to the Tilly front, following the 50th Division's advance. Trucks were loaded, stretchers lifted. The wounded who could be moved were evacuated toward the beachhead. Private Millen was among them, classified now as post-operative, stable. His chart bore a single annotation, reclassified by nursing staff, 12-6-44. Thompson's action had been recorded, if only as a bureaucratic curiosity. But within the camp, the story spread quickly. Some called it bravery, others recklessness. The young orderlies whispered of the sister who saved the lad they left for dead. That evening, as the unit halted to pitch camp once more, Thompson sat alone on a supply crate, cleaning instruments by lamplight. The rhythmic clink of metal against enamel mingled with the distant drone of aircraft. For the first time since dawn, she allowed herself to tremble. In the quiet that followed, she wrote a single line in her small field diary. "Rules are made for order, but life has its own authority." That line, later quoted in the unit's post-war oral history, would come to define the moral heart of her story. The following day, the CCS matron sent her brief report to 21st Army Group headquarters. It was factual, unembellished, unauthorized use of plasma. Result: survival of case previously deemed expectant. Recommend no further action. But the moment had passed into something larger, a silent question echoing through the British medical service. Could compassion itself be an act of insubordination? By the afternoon of 13 June 1944, the clearing station near Bayeux had become a caravan of exhaustion. Canvas, crates, and cots were loaded onto lorries, engines coughing into life as the unit shifted east to keep pace with the advancing front. Rain threatened again, but the work continued without pause. In the makeshift command tent, Matron Brooks sat at a folding table, pen poised above the daily report. Her logbook, smudged with fingerprints and dried mud, contained the entry she could neither ignore nor condemn. The words were minimal. Sister Thompson acted outside authorized procedure. Patient survived. No disciplinary recommendation. It was military prose at its most British. Restrained, factual, utterly devoid of drama. Yet behind those few lines lay a collision of ethics, hierarchy, and the quiet assertion of human judgment in war. The report reached headquarters, 21st Army Group Medical Branch, 2 days later. The officer reviewing it, Colonel Edward Lang, had served in the last war and understood the unspoken codes of military medicine. He read the entry twice, initialed it, and wrote a marginal note. Commend outcome. No further correspondence required. With that, the matter was officially closed, filed and forgotten. But within the unit, the repercussions rippled quietly. That night, Thompson returned to duty as if nothing had happened. She scrubbed floors, checked morphine doses, and recorded pulse rates under the same dim lamps. Yet she noticed the subtle shift, the glances exchanged, the half-smiles of gratitude from orderlies, the silence of senior staff who chose not to mention her name aloud. Among the men she had treated, word spread faster. Soldiers spoke of her in letters home, the nurse who wouldn't give up. One corporal, later interviewed for the Imperial War Museum's 1972 D-Day Oral History Project, recalled, "She moved through that tent like she'd been there forever. Never shouted, never stopped. You'd trust her with your life, and a few of us owe her ours." It was this quiet reputation, unofficial, unrecorded, that kept morale alive among the wounded. For them, Sister Thompson was not a symbol of disobedience, but of endurance. She had proven that the uniform could contain both discipline and mercy. The Royal Army Medical Corps officers, though bound by regulations, recognized her professionalism. One major later noted in a post-campaign reflection, The best nurses are those who know when to forget the book. It was an unspoken truth of war, that rigid obedience could kill as surely as enemy fire. Still, Thompson herself remained uneasy. She knew the cost of overstepping. In North Africa, she had seen colleagues dismissed for far less. The British Army's strength lay in its order, and order demanded consistency. Her act had succeeded, but what if it had failed? What if the boy had died on the table? The same decision that had saved him could easily have destroyed her. That night, she received a brief visit from Matron Brooks. The conversation was short, their voices low beneath the rain beating on the tent canvas. "You understand, Margaret," Brooks said. "I can't condone it." "I know, Matron. But I can't forget it either." Brooks turned to leave, then paused. "You did your duty as you saw it. That must be enough." It was a rare admission from a woman of her rank, an acknowledgement that regulation and morality were not always aligned. For Thompson, it was a quiet vindication. 2 days later, as the unit redeployed closer to Caen, a supply officer delivered a fresh consignment of plasma. The accompanying requisition note bore an unusual annotation, likely written by the matron herself, authorized for use at nurses' discretion in emergency conditions. It was a subtle, almost invisible reform, unofficial, unannounced, but real. Within that small change lay the legacy of Thompson's act, a recognition that compassion, when grounded in skill, could be trusted. The boy she had saved, Private Arthur Millen, was evacuated to a hospital ship on 15th of June and transferred to the Royal Victoria Hospital, Netley. His medical record survives in the War Office casualty lists marked simply, "Recovered, returned to duty, September 1944. Thompson never saw him again, but years later a letter reached her home in Preston. It was written in a careful hand dated Christmas 1946. "Dear sister, I don't know if you'll remember me. I was at the field hospital near Bayeux. They said I wouldn't make it. You did. I've a wife now and a son. We called him Arthur. Thank you for breaking the rules." The letter was folded into her nursing diary, where it remained until her death in 1982. That June morning had changed nothing officially, and yet everything quietly. The RAMC continued its procedures. The QIMs upheld its discipline. But in tents and wards across Europe, nurses whispered Thompson's story as reassurance that humanity still had a place amid the machinery of war. In a conflict defined by strategy and firepower, her defiance was small, almost invisible, yet in that invisibility lay its power. It reminded those who served that the moral front was as vital as any battlefield, and that victory was not measured only in ground gained, but in lives refused to be lost. The war would grind on, through Caen, through Arnhem, through the long winter of 1944, but the spirit that carried the British medical services endured. Quiet, disciplined, compassionate. By late summer 1944, the Allied advance across France was relentless. The beaches of Normandy had become supply lines, and the casualty clearing stations that once stood among hedgerows now moved behind the lines of pursuit toward Amiens, Brussels, and later the Rhine. For the nursing staff of the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service, it was a rhythm that blurred the front from the rear, the living from the dying. Within that tide of movement, Sister Margaret Thompson's act faded into the background of operational reports. The Army's bureaucracy, built to handle divisions and brigades, had little space for singular moments of defiance. Her name did not appear in dispatches or commendations. No medal was issued. Yet among those who had served beside her, her reputation lingered, not as a heroine, but as a nurse who quietly decided that rules could not outweigh life. In September, Matron Brooks submitted her quarterly report to the Directorate of Army Nursing Services in London. Among the neat typewritten lines on hygiene, supply, and personnel efficiency, one section stood out. "Initiative in crisis has saved many lives. Nurses continue to act beyond expectation under pressure, often assuming medical responsibilities in the absence of officers. It is recommended that field discretion be formally recognized in extreme conditions." The wording was cautious, but the intent unmistakable. It was a direct reflection of the moral tension exposed in Bayeux, the line between obedience and compassion. While no individual was named, those who read the report at War Office, Whitehall, understood its implication. Over the following months, quiet adjustments began to appear in Army medical directives. Field nurses were granted greater autonomy in triage situations, authorized to initiate transfusions where delay would risk life. It was a small but meaningful reform, one born not from committee rooms, but from the experience of nurses like Thompson, who had refused to let a patient die in silence. Back in Britain, public awareness of the nurses' work grew. The BBC Home Service, in a broadcast titled Women at the Front, October 1944, described the conditions in Normandy, the heat, the shell fire, the endurance of those who work without rest, without glory and without complaint. Though unnamed, Thompson's example echoed through the accounts gathered by war correspondents. The Imperial War Museum later received several private letters from servicemen treated in the early Normandy hospitals. One wrote, "We knew the doctors were brilliant, but it was the nurses who kept us alive between operations. They seemed to know what you needed before you could say it." For Thompson herself, the months after Normandy were quieter but no less demanding. She served with the 21st Army Group through the winter, treating casualties from the Battle of the Bulge and the advance into Germany. Her diaries, now held in a private family collection, show no mention of commendation or reprimand, only fatigue and a brief note dated 8 May 1945. V-Day. "The guns have stopped. I am glad, but the silence feels strange." When the war ended, she returned to civilian nursing in Preston, working at the local infirmary. Like many veterans, she spoke little of what she had seen. Her wartime colleagues remembered her as composed and private, the sort of woman who didn't talk about courage, she just lived it. The moral question that had haunted the field hospitals of 1944 did not fade easily. Post-war inquiries into military medical ethics, especially during the Korean War, would revisit the same dilemmas faced by Thompson and her generation. How far should a nurse go beyond protocol to save a life, and who bears the consequence when they do? In that sense, her forbidden act became more than a single moment of defiance. It became part of a broader legacy, the slow transformation of battlefield medicine from rigid hierarchy to compassionate autonomy. And though her name never appeared in official citations, her influence lived on in the quiet shift of policy, and the countless soldiers who survived because someone, somewhere, chose humanity over hesitation. In the post-war years, Britain began to take stock, not just of its cities and industries, but of the moral fabric that had held the nation together through 6 years of war. Memorials rose in stone and bronze across the country, yet the quiet endurance of the medical services was harder to commemorate. Their courage left no craters, no battle maps, only lives restored, limbs saved, and a legacy written in hospital ledgers rather than headlines. For the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service, the war had reshaped everything. Over 12,000 women had served in uniform between 1939 and 1945, from Malta to Burma, from the deserts of Egypt to the beaches of Normandy. They had endured bombing raids, shipwrecks, epidemics, and exhaustion, often within reach of the front line. Many never returned. Yet their service changed the British Army forever. The lessons learned from their field decisions, from nurses like Sister Margaret Thompson, quietly informed the creation of the Royal Army Nursing Corps in 1949, an institution that would carry forward their spirit of initiative and professionalism. In that same year, the Royal College of Nursing published a retrospective report on wartime service. Buried among its appendices was a paragraph that could easily have referred to Thompson. There were occasions when compassion exceeded regulation. In those moments, it was not disobedience that saved life, but the clear moral courage to act when time forbade hesitation. It was the closest thing to public recognition that many field nurses would ever receive. By the early 1950s, as Britain rebuilt under rationing and austerity, veterans of the medical corps resumed ordinary lives. The world moved on. But in the quieter corridors of provincial hospitals, their discipline and methods endured, sterile routines perfected under fire, triage systems refined in tents, and a calm professionalism that defined a generation of British nurses. Sister Thompson, by then matron of a Lancashire infirmary, carried her war quietly within her. Staff remembered her precision, her insistence that every life deserves a chance, however small, and the way she would pause before signing off any critical care report. As if remembering another tent, another decision far from home, she retired in 1968. In her modest sitting room stood a small wooden box containing her wartime medals, the 1939-45 Star, the Africa Star, the France and Germany Star, and the Defense Medal. Beside them lay the single letter from the soldier she had saved in Normandy, folded neatly beneath the lid. When she passed away in 1982, her personal papers were donated by a niece to the Imperial War Museum's nursing archive. Among them was a single diary entry that historians often quote when describing the ethos of the wartime nurses. "I broke a rule, but not my oath." The rule was written for order. The oath was taken for life. Those 12 words have since appeared in lectures, exhibitions, and documentaries, a quiet summary of what the British nursing services embodied during the war. They remind us that courage in uniform does not always carry a weapon, and that duty is sometimes defined not by command, but by conscience. The Imperial War Museum's exhibit, Medicine and Morality in War, now features her story, alongside the broader history of British military nursing. It stands not as a tale of defiance, but as one of human judgment amid chaos, a portrait of the quiet moral clarity that guided thousands of British nurses through the war's darkest hours. For every Spitfire in the sky, there was a hand holding a bandage in the mud below. For every victory announced on the wireless, there was a nurse working through the night to keep that victory alive. And in that balance between rule and mercy, between obedience and conscience, lay one of Britain's truest acts of courage. War, in the end, is not only measured in battles won or borders redrawn, but in the choices made quietly, often unseen, by those who refuse to let compassion perish in the noise. Sister Margaret Thompson's act in Normandy was one of thousands that never reached the official record. Yet such moments formed the moral spine of Britain's war effort. In every field hospital, in every ward lit by a single hurricane lamp, nurses stood as the last defense between order and oblivion. Their courage was not loud. It was steady, deliberate, and deeply human. The British way of endurance during the Second World War was rarely declared. It was demonstrated. In the laboratories of Bletchley and the watchtowers of the RAF, in the basements of bombed hospitals, people simply did what was required and a little more. The nurses of the Queen Alexandra's service were no exception. They did not fight for glory, but for life itself. In the decades that followed, historians often described the war as a triumph of technology, of planning, of national resolve. Yet behind every machine, every decision, stood individuals guided by something older and quieter: conscience. Thompson's defiance, small in scale, immeasurable in spirit, reflected that truth. She broke a rule but preserved the meaning of duty. Her hand on that transfusion bottle in June 1944 was not rebellion. It was reaffirmation that even amid industrialized war, humanity must remain sovereign. Today, her name rests not among medals or statues, but in the files and footnotes of Britain's wartime nursing records. And perhaps that is as it should be. Her legacy lies not in recognition, but in reflection. A reminder that the most enduring acts of courage are often those that pass quietly through history, leaving the world gentler than they found it. In the stillness after battle, when the guns finally ceased and the tents were folded away, one truth remained clear. The strength of Britain's war lay not only in her armies but in her humanity. It was that calm, steadfast compassion, embodied in one nurse's forbidden act, that saved not only lives but a nation's soul.